are growing in humility,
Yes.
as you have said.
Yeah. Yeah. I think that's basically right. That's at least my answer for now. So.
Thank you,
Yeah.
sir.
Can we be humble at the same time be so bold in preaching like this Sunday?
Yes.
Yeah, the Bible says be strong and be of good courage. So
Yeah.
Be very confident, be
Yeah.
bold, confront sin,
Yeah.
and preach
Yeah.
like hellfire.
Yeah.
Can we
Yes.
be humble?
That is a fantastic question, Pastor Willie. So the question is, can we be really bold the way that many preachers have to be, and at the same time be humble? I think that's a great question. We have to say yes, right? I mean, the gospel demands a kind of courage of us that that especially many in the postmodern and pluralist world, many people would say that just believing that Jesus is the only way, that's bold enough already, right? Because you're automatically saying everyone else who doesn't trust Jesus is going to hell. So for sure, that has to be okay. That must be within the realm of what we are called to do as Christians. I think the thing that strikes me about Billy Sunday, or let's say Martin Luther, another very bold figure who was willing to say very hard things, harsh things, the thing that strikes me about that is I think about the Jeremiah 9 passage, right? So Martin Luther or Billy Sunday were not bold because they felt they were really wise, or because they felt they were really strong, or really, extra special. There was nothing about them. It was that they had heard from God. God had spoken to them through His Word. And so the boldness was not rooted in themselves. It was rooted in God and in God's relationship to them. So I think that's the root thing here. Now, the other side of this is just, honestly, when we look at different pastors, even I'm sure within Ackville, we have really different personalities, right? Some are very firm and very hard-charging. They want to drive in a certain direction. And that's going to come out in their preaching. And others are a little more modest, a little more contemplative. Instead of saying, this is what we need to do, they will say, I wonder if we should do this, right? And I think one thing we need to learn is that God needs all of those personalities. He uses all of those personalities. And the truth is, the hard-charging ones, they will have a harder time with humility, generally. But they are also bringing a gift. They're bringing courage and strength. The other ones will have an easier time with humility, but they will have a harder time with courage. And that's why we need each other to balance each other out, right? So we can't all be just one type of pastor. So great question. I don't know, do you want to follow up, or that's okay? All right. Good morning.
We know that humility is the character of Christ. And how about the unbelievers who pursue humility? Are they also pursuing the character of Christ? My second question is, and if they have that virtue, are they pursuing the right thing?
Oh, that's a wonderful question. Let me write it down so I don't forget your two parts. So actually, you've touched on a big debate in humility studies. So there is a position that says unbelievers cannot have humility at all. That basically, without a relationship with Christ, humility is off limits for you. It just can't be done. I don't subscribe to that view because I've encountered a lot of non-believers who really have a lot of the marks of humility. They defer to others. They don't think about themselves a lot. They know their limits. They give up their rights for others. All right. So that does create a conundrum, okay? So if this is something that is sort of available through Christ, how are they getting access to it? The theological answer for me has to do with common grace. Common grace is this idea that, there's the special grace that God gives through His Son and His Spirit to His people. But God is gracious, and even outside of His church, He is working. The Holy Spirit works. This is a long-time doctrine of the church. The Holy Spirit works all through society to help constrain sin so that things are not as bad as they would possibly be. In other words, if the Holy Spirit were to completely not help anyone outside the church, then it would be just disaster. It would be war and chaos all the time. And so what allows governments to work, what allows non-believers to have some measurement of grace and virtue is this common grace, the Spirit working outside of His church. So I would say through God's common grace, a non-believer can cultivate humility or any of the other virtues. But they cannot cultivate it in its fullness. They will always only have a partial experience of it. Because fundamentally, humility is so tied up with Jesus. True humility only will arise when a person comes to Jesus and says, "You are my master and I need you to save me." And so as a result, someone who has not had that experience simply can't experience the full power of Christian humility. Does that make sense? So I would say, are they pursuing the right thing? Yes. I think many non-believers instinctively know, because God has written the law in their hearts, they know that humility is valuable. And they might even try to cultivate it. But they're doing it on their own strength and only by God's sort of common help, rather than seeking the true source of really the full force of humility in Christ. So I don't know, do you want to follow up, or is that okay? Okay. Great questions. This is fun.
Good morning, Pastor Steve. First of all, we like to thank you for giving us, somehow you've given us a map of how to understand humility. Because we look at the scriptures and somehow what we have is a fragmented idea of humility. Now my question is, in 2 Corinthians we can see Paul boasting about Corinthian believers to encourage the Macedonian believers. Now, this is my two-part question. First, can we do that today? Can we encourage others by boasting about something?
Yeah.
And my second question is, how can we ensure, if we are going to do that, how can we ensure that our boasting leads to Christ?
Yeah.
And yeah, I only have
Okay.
two-part question.
Yeah. All right. Thank you. Great question. Great question. So let me try to formulate an answer here. What also comes to mind is when Paul also encourages, I forget where it is, but he says, try to outdo one another in love, right? And he almost makes it sound like it should be like a competition, right? Like, compete with your neighbors, see who can be more loving. So in general, my answer to questions like this is that just because Paul did something, it doesn't necessarily mean we should do it, right? And I would say the same thing about Jesus. to be honest. I think just because Jesus did something doesn't mean it's good for you, right? Jesus died on a cross. That doesn't mean you need to do that, literally, right? There are things about Jesus that you must imitate, and I would say similarly, there are things about Paul that you must imitate. And those things are tied up with humility, with being willing to suffer, or things like that. Things that are explicitly marked as things that you have to imitate. But let's just think about this. So what would it look like? It would look like saying, this and such church has raised this amount of money for missions. Why? How come you guys aren't doing that, right? I think that's fine. I think it requires wisdom. So Paul obviously had to know the Macedonian church well enough that he knew this wouldn't just offend them and hurt them, right? So it requires wisdom in our situation too. You have to know who you're dealing with. But yeah, absolutely. I think that we as churches should be trying to outdo one another in love and in service to Christ. It can become a problem when it becomes like a legalistic measurement, right? So when it's like, I guess because it interferes with motivation, right? So at some point, your church might just start trying to give big offerings to missions, not because they want to see more people worshiping God, but just because they want the pride of being, elevated, right? Getting first prize in the competition. And that's where you don't really want it to go. But yeah, fundamentally, I guess I don't have a problem with that. Your second question is, how can we ensure it leads to Christ? And I guess that's what I'm worried about. So I would say it should not be legalistic in the sense that this is required for salvation, right? We shouldn't have anything like that where we're saying, if you read the Bible more than the X amount, then God will love you more, or you'll have a higher place in heaven, or less years in purgatory, right? There's nothing, you can't have anything like that. Instead, you need to make sure that you're turning the attention always back to Christ. The reason we want our churches to raise money for missions is because Christ deserves praise from every tongue and tribe and nation, and we want that to happen. So I think that's okay, as long as there is this constant pull back to Christ. So I think you were on already answering your own question there, which is great. Yeah. So I don't know. Do you want to follow up?
I have one personal question.
Sure.
You have mastered humility. Do you plan to do another virtue? On the study of another virtue?
All right. This is what we call a loaded question, right? No. I'm not. Obviously, I don't think I've mastered humility. I have a lot of work to do still, in understanding it and in cultivating it. Right now, I don't have plans to work on another virtue. I think I am fascinated by the virtues, and I would love over my teaching career to work through them. If I were going to do another one, I don't know. I think hope would be an interesting one. I think hope is interesting. But yeah, for now I feel like I still have a lot of work to do on humility. I mean, I'm working on I'm trying to write a multi-chapter book that's more for popular audiences. The one that Pastor Leo showed you, that's so expensive, was really for scholars. And I'm trying to write something here that would be more practical, and so that's my current work at the moment. And it's trying to tackle very basic questions like, how can I be humble but still say to my non-believing friend, I believe I'm right and you're going to hell, right? How does that work with humility? So there's a lot of things like that that I'm still thinking through. Yeah. Thanks.
Any follow-up question?
Yeah.
Regarding doing something great for the Lord.
Okay. Yeah.
William Carey says,
Yes.
expect great things, attempt great things.
Right.
And also, Jobez said, enlarge my territory. So how can you do that at the same time? Stay humble.
Yeah. All right. Yeah. So this is something we've touched on now and then, but maybe it's good to give it some attention head on. Honestly, I'm still trying to work this out, Pastor. I see, I see part of the answer must be that when William Carey says, expect great things from God, attempt great things for God, he's not talking about like, seek to be the best-selling author, right? Or seek to be the best, the biggest, have the biggest church, right? That's not his point. The point is, actually, I think it might be better if it was rephrased like this. Attempt hard things for God and expect great things from God. I think that's really more the message he was sending. When in his community, he was trying to, for those who are less familiar, so William Carey was what we consider the father of modern missions, going from England to India. And at the time, the attitude of the church that he was a part of was, we don't need to do anything because God will take care of it himself. He'll, send a vision or something, and people will become Christians if God wants them to. And what William Carey said was, no, he invites us to be a part of it. And though it's very expensive and very difficult, we have to try it. And that was the context in which he says this. I guess, I'm still trying to think this through. I do think there must be a place for something like holy ambition. Sort of like self-esteem, right? Self-esteem can be very problematic. It can be an attitude of, I'm good enough, which is the opposite of what the gospel tells us. I think ambition is similar, right? And it's notable that in the New Testament, very often when the word ambition is used, it's modified. It's not just that ambition is bad, it's selfish ambition that is really a problem. So the ambition to translate the Bible into all the remaining languages in the next generation, that's a holy ambition. That is seeking to do something hard and big and good. That seems like the kind of thing that fits this piece of advice. And it doesn't seem in conflict with humility as much, right? It seems like what we're really saying when we express that kind of ambition is, Lord, we want your kingdom to be spread. And not, I want my kingdom to grow. Right? I have a little more concern about the prayer of Jabez for that reason. I think I don't think that there was anything wrong with the material, but one of the ways that people interpreted it was really as a request for God to enlarge their wealth, right? To basically say, grow my kingdom. And I don't think that's what the authors intended, but I think that's how many people interpreted it. And I think that can't be right. That's not consistent with humility. Lord, advance your kingdom, not advance my kingdom, or Ackville's kingdom even, right? That's too small a dream. We want God's kingdom advanced. And when we replace ourselves there, then that's where it becomes more like an act of pride rather than an act of courage. I don't know. Does that... What do you think? Okay, all right. Yeah.
Steve. I'm thinking more about leadership. As a colleague, and also as part of the church, what can we do to help keep our leaders humble? Because right now, when I think of the church, some churches are now beginning to introduce this practice, which is very common in the West. The pastors appreciation. So what can we do? What seems to be a healthy appreciation of our leaders? That's one area that we would like to do for our pastors and our leaders.
Yeah, thank you. It's a great question. So, it sounds like, it sounds like what you're talking about is there's an inherent tension when we talk about pastoral leadership. The relationship between the pastor and the congregation. There is a tension between the congregation needs to respect that leader, needs to be willing to submit to that leader, and needs to appreciate that leader. They need to really love him. That is on one side. On the other side, we have this, what we're saying right now is that we really want that leader to stay humble. And it seems like those two things are on a collision track, right? If we're telling the congregation always to submit, always to be appreciative, always whatever, then it's hard also to tell the pastor all of those things are going to make him feel like he doesn't need to be humble. Like they need to be humble, right? Whereas what we're saying here is that humility actually should flow the other way, that he should lead by example in humility. It is very hard. I guess I think of this as a tension that is a healthy tension. That, like the tension of a guitar string, if it's not tense enough, it won't work. And so you need some balance between these two things, and it requires wisdom in any given situation to figure it out. I do think as Christian communities, we should be very conscious of how our culture views authority and the tendencies in our culture. So, speaking for American culture, now America is a big place with lots of different cultures in it, but generally, Americans tend to not respect authority very much. They tend to have a very casual attitude toward those in authority. Especially as compared to generally here in Asia, especially a teacher or someone else is viewed very highly, right? And that's why when I teach in the United States, my students are always, they'll argue with you, right? They'll say, no, you're wrong, professor, right? And in this context, we would say, oh, that's so disrespectful. But for them, that's just sort of how it should be, right? So I would say the danger in American culture, the prevailing danger is that we will go too far on this side, that we will be too not submissive enough to the pastor. And so we need to push against that. We need to push against our culture's tendencies. The question I guess I have is for here, what is our cultural tendency? Do we tend to have too much power in pastors? Are pastors too powerful, too proud, is the congregation too submissive generally? Or is it usually the reverse? The congregation is very feisty and the pastor doesn't have a lot of power. Depending on which one is true, I think we have to push the opposite way. So if it's the case that in our communities, the pastors tend to be acquiring too much power, then there are simple things you can do. I mean, number one, you can have processes that will keep that authority in check. So you can demand that every church have a strong elder board that can tell the pastor, no, we think you need to change this, right? On the other hand, if the pattern is that the congregations tend to be too unsubmissive or whatever, then maybe having moments in which the congregation acknowledges the hard work of the pastor, recognizes the work they've done in terms of education and so on, maybe that's the way we need to sort of lift up that side of the level. But I don't know. I mean, it's a great question in terms of sort of how the practicalities play out. I don't know. I'm curious. What's your sense from Filipino churches or Actfil churches? What tends to be more of the problem? That the pastor is too exalted, or that the congregation is too strong?
I think we see both of them here. It's just that I'm more concerned right now about those of us in the leadership. How can our people minister to them so that they can keep themselves humble, or they can continue cultivating humility? And what, like, in the context of the school, what are our students doing that is not helping their teachers cultivate humility?
Right.
And also the churches.
Right.
I think partly if we find a leader that is too proud as he is, I think part of the reason for that is what the congregations are doing. Something is not probably right. It's not just the leader. There's something there that probably the congregation is not doing to help the pastor keep himself humble.
So usually there's some fault, there's blame to spread around. I mean, all I would say is, I think we should be conscious of what's happening in our congregations and always be pushing to try to keep that balance balanced. I do think there is power in having patterns of life or rituals that can remind us of our need to be humble before one another. So some churches in the U.S. do foot washing consistently to do this. There are others who say, well, it doesn't have a cultural meaning like it did in the ancient Near East, but there has to be something that you're doing that is really powerfully communicating that we are not a kind of community that's like the world, where everybody is just fighting for power and everyone's trying to get as much power as possible. That we're a radically different community where the most humble are the ones who are most worthy of leadership. So I really do think we should be thinking about, on the symbolic level, in addition to the practical steps, the things about how you organize your church polity and things like that. I think those are important too. But those symbols, to me, are very powerful. They really say something when a new pastor comes in or something like that. So.
Steve, you talked about friendship with God.
Mm-hmm.
And as I try to observe, for for us as also pastoring, the church, I think many times we miss the nature of being a friend to our people. And so being a friend in the truest sense, I think what I've learned from the steps, you made mention about number 4, talk less and listen more. So one of the models that I like, about leadership is a leader as a listening conversationalist. One of the things that perhaps we miss, the point, and many times I miss it, like, how to be a friend to our people, how to be a friend to fellow worker, how to be a friend to fellow, like, girl students here.
Yeah.
So I like the idea of being, you made mention, going back to Jeremiah 9:23 and 24, the key to resolving the tension in Jeremiah. Is Jeremiah 9 only friendship with God? And I find this very interesting. And I know Klaus Isler. He wrote a book about wasting time with God. And it's about friendship. So how would you connect it? Because as pastors, we tend to, even in counseling, we tend to dictate and we have already a fixed answer. I think your problem is this. Without, being a friend, and being a friend is like, so how would you, and then the other side would be vulnerability. So how would you connect humility, with vulnerability and, the model?
Yeah, excellent. So I'll start at the end there. I mean, I think absolutely cultivating an ability to be vulnerable with our congregants or with our students or with our fellow pastors, that can be a real training in humility, right? I mean, this is why accountability groups can be such a helpful force in our spiritual lives, because just having to admit to your neighbor, whoever it is, it could be a stranger, but having to say out loud, honestly, I am really angry with God right now. Or, honestly, I'm really struggling with this sin. That ability to be vulnerable can help you be humble. It can work very effectively. And maybe that's one of the answers to what you were talking about, Pastor Louboutin. I think it would be healthy for pastors to be in groups with other pastors where they can really be honest with each other about their struggles. That will help keep them humble. It should. On the issue of friendship, both with God and with our congregation, I think the title of the book really hits the nail on the head, Wasting Time with God. Because one of the things about friendship, in our conception of it, is that what's the difference between your friendship with a friend and your relationship with your suki at the market? What's the difference? Well, your suki is kind of a friend, right? Sort of. But they're your friend in a transactional sense, right? They're your friend in terms of they'll give you a good price and you'll come to them regularly. There's a transactional nature in the relationship. You don't go to your suki and just sit there, at their stall and sit there and talk, right? You might talk a little bit, but you're not going to invite them to your wedding, right, or whatever, right? The point is, in friendship, we waste time with each other. We just be together for no reason. If you have a friend and you only ever go do something together for a transaction, it's not a friendship. It's a partnership or a business relationship or something like that, right? And so that's so critical, especially here in the Philippines. In my observation, we spend a lot of time with each other. As compared to Americans or many Westerners, pastors are expected often to build a relationship takes a lot of time. Having meals together, just sitting together. And that's also the kind of relationship we need to have with God. Our relationship with God should not be transactional. We don't want to be the people who are just going to God like, okay, I need X, Y, and Z. Please provide, right? So we can sometimes treat God that way, like He's a vending machine, right? And we're basically making our selections and He's sending down His supplies. What we should be pursuing is real friendship, which means just being with God, which again requires silence or some quiet. You can do it when there's noise, but it's easiest when there's less distractions. So, yeah, I mean, I think you hit on a lot of really key things there. Friendship with God, friendship with others requires time, and there's no shortcuts.
Hello. I'm just asking about, is it sinful to brag about something? Because I'm a proud father of a good-looking son. And is it God bragging when He's talking about Job with this Satan?
Yeah, right. Excellent question. This is one of the things that I'm wrestling with too as I'm trying to think through all the practical implications of humility. Yeah, I mean, most of us, if you have kids or if you have a nephew, you're proud of them, right? When maybe because they're handsome, but maybe because they did a good job in school, because they fought their fear and they learned how to ride a bicycle. You know, you have this feeling in your heart. Pride, right? That's what we call it, at least. We call it pride. And so I think there's a great question here. Is that fundamentally the kind of pride we're talking about that is this disease that kills us? So I'm prone to say it's not the same thing. I'm actually prone to say that what we have here is a confusion that's caused by linguistics. So we call that pride, but we also call ugly things pride. You know, we call it pride when someone believes that they're better than their neighbor, or that they deserve more than the one next to them. And I guess what I would say is it seems like the English language, and maybe Tagalog also, is having a hard time distinguishing between two different things, and it just lumps them under the same word, pride. It seems to me the experience of the joy of a job well done is not inconsistent with a Christ-like pattern of humility. So again, the joy of a job well done, or of a child. I mean, because essentially that's what you're saying, right? It's like, I did a good job with this boy. He's handsome, right? He's handsome because of you, right? Or your wife, or both. So, I mean, I think, and it's the same feeling you get after you accomplish something hard, right? If you have a big challenge, something that's very intimidating to you, and you do it, there's a positive feeling that emerges, right? That erupts in your heart. You feel joy. So, I don't know. I think the language is actually having a problem with us. Maybe we should say, instead of saying, I'm proud of my kids, or I'm proud that I accomplished this thing, maybe we should use a different word. Say, I have great joy. It brings me great joy that my son is a handsome, obedient young man, right? Maybe that's a better way of speaking. But no, I don't think there's anything fundamentally about that attitude that is in conflict with humility. That's a great question.
Here and one here.
Sir, just a curious question. Is it wrong to assess people's humility? I mean, in the context, for example, of choosing leaders in your church, or choosing people to fill key responsibilities. Is it wrong to assess their
Great
humility?
question. Great question. Is it wrong to assess the humility of others? So I would say it's really a necessity. If we're going to take humility seriously as one of the requirements for leadership, how can you not assess it, right? I think the one thing I would say is that we should acknowledge that humility is such a tricky thing to detect that we can sometimes get a false positive and we can sometimes get a false negative. In other words, I'm trying to think of a similar, let's say there was a cancer of some kind, I don't know. A cancer that was very hard to spot, and that sometimes it looks like other things. So sometimes you'll think a person has that cancer and they don't, and sometimes you'll think they don't have it, but they do, all right? So in that situation, would you tell a doctor, you shouldn't try to look for it at all, right? No, you would say, look for it, do your best, make an assessment, but when you tell the patient, yes, you have cancer, no, you don't, tell them, we think, based on this evidence, you have this disease. But we might be wrong. I think it can be similar when we're assessing the humility of others. And I'm assuming we're in the context here of, let's say you're the leadership of a church, the elders, and you're looking to call a pastor, and you're interviewing 3. You can say to your fellow elders, I could be wrong, but it seems like candidate A really has a problem with pride. Now, I could be wrong. It's a very tricky thing to try to assess. It may turn out that he actually is very humble, and he just came across the wrong way. So I think it's fine to assess it, but we need to acknowledge that we don't really know anyone's heart. It's impossible to really see the truth. Yeah.
Is it wrong to affirm people's humility? And if not, how can we affirm it or properly affirm it?
Yeah, that's a great question. So when this comes up when we think about how do we become a community that values humility, I don't think it's wrong to affirm it. So at my kids' school, they have this interesting practice where they try to reward students who are doing really well, doing something really well. And what'll happen is the teacher can write them up and say, we caught this student doing this virtuous thing, right? And then later in the week, they'll get recognized in chapel. Everyone will stand up and clap for them, and they get a little pencil or something. And one of the things is humility. So I was surprised one day my daughter Ava came home with a pencil that said, humility. I said, what's this? And she explained, her teacher saw her doing something humble, apparently, and decided to recognize her for it in front of all her friends. And I thought, oh, that's strange, right? But really, it makes a lot of sense. It's not, there's nothing inherently wrong with recognizing someone exercising that virtue. That's great. If it makes us feel awkward as a community, then I would suggest finding a different way to recognize it. So you can recognize a person, so for example, when there's a big event, and there's usually a few people who do a lot of work in just the manual labor, setting up the chairs, setting up the tables, whatever. You can recognize people for their service, without saying, thank you for being humble, right? That might be a less awkward way of doing it. But honestly, I think our communities would be better if we were open about just saying, like, I really appreciated the humility of this person publicly. I think that's a good idea. Yeah.
No po. Thus true humility should totally and continually reflect in all areas or aspects in the life of a person, or there's only such or chosen areas in the life of a person which is growing in humility.